Loosely themed around the great powers of Europe prior to World War I, the game of diplomacy is infamous for two things: destroying friendships and changing the way players approach other games. Self-published in 1959 by Allan B. Calhammer, diplomacy uses exceedingly simple and elegant mechanisms to create a highly social game that is won or lost through negotiation and deception. Diplomacy was a pioneer in the play-by-mail space, with players being able to participate in games no matter where they lived. And that's why diplomacy has been inducted into the BoardGameGeek Hall of Fame for 2025.
Diplomacy is one of 3 games that came out right around the same time. Risk, Tactics 2, which was the predecessor of all the Avalon Hill style war games, and Diplomacy all came out in 1958, 1959. And all obviously are still incredibly impactful decades later. And it's really interesting because Diplomacy has a very specific perspective that it's trying to get across. And, all games and simulation games in particular, the designer needs to take a perspective. And the perspective of Allan Calhammer, the designer of Diplomacy, is that conflict is ultimately about alliances and about psychology and about how you can convince other people to be your friends. And so to do that, the game itself, rules-wise, it's a little bit complicated, I guess, but there's really stripped down to the basics. There's just 2 types of units, armies and navies. The stroke of genius is really that you have to write down your orders for each of the units, and then you just reveal them simultaneously. And there's very simple ways of resolving battles and things like that. There's no chance at all. If 2 people are trying to move into the same space, if they've got the same power, then they just bounce off each other and nobody touches it. If you're trying to knock somebody else out of a space, you have to have more power than them. And since you only start the game with 3 pieces or 4, you have to have friends. You have to have allies working together in order to do it. And that's where the genius of the game lies. If you have not had a chance to play Diplomacy, it is well worth your time. It has a reputation of destroying friendships because you have to just sometimes absolutely lie to somebody's face and then just turn around and you're going to write something different down on your paper.
Not very many games from 1959 have aged as gracefully as Diplomacy. Diplomacy is one of those games, the first time I learned it, I was so frustrated by its limitations. I couldn't believe you only have 1 unit in each spot, and yet it's those limitations that make the game so fascinating. It is one of the best negotiation games ever made, and yet there's almost nothing to negotiate. But you'll be at a meeting with another power and you'll realize that the fact that you know what France might do is itself a bit of a currency. Diplomacy allows players to be outrageously inventive in what things are worth money. The fact that it plays real time means that all players are engaged the entire game. There just aren't very many games about global geopolitics that are so light on their feet as Diplomacy. You can play it on your phone, you can play it on the computer, you can play it with a hall full of 100 people, and it works great at any count.
At USC Games, I use Diplomacy in my class to teach emergent narrative. It's an amazing game because simple mechanics with important historical context create amazing stories of European conflict prior to World War I in general. Most of the important parts of this game take place away from the board. Players only gather around the board to make their moves, and then they go away to have meetings and discuss. And that negotiating dynamic and interpersonal dynamic becomes really powerful. But I do think that the historical context and the map are really important because it grounds the players in a sense of the culture, a sense of the geography, and a sense of the military goals. And it is complicated in its interactions in where the rules come together, but the basic rules are not complicated.
Diplomacy is a pure negotiation and bluffing game, and certainly the granddaddy of this genre. You cannot completely win this game without lying or bluffing sooner or later. In fact, the tagline that is often associated with this game is Diplomacy, ruining friendships since 1959. The concepts established here in this game have been done many times since, but this game is pure negotiation and bluffing, and absolutely amazing. You help me here, I'll help you there, but sooner or later, the backstabbing's gonna start.
The granddaddy of all negotiation games, Diplomacy. First published in 1959, Diplomacy has had countless memes and jokes talking about how it has ruined friendships for decades. And it's not lying. Players are representatives of countries negotiating terms and contracts and deals so that they can have world domination for their country. Wargaming isn't something that gets talked a lot about on BGG. And even though there are countless negotiation games, few do it better and are more memorable than Diplomacy. I myself was a huge Diplomacy player until the day someone threw a chair at me, in which case I took a hiatus for several years. It was a big chair. And I probably deserved it. But Diplomacy remains a classic today and deserves its induction into this Hall of Fame.
Thank you to all the contributors who helped make this video, and thank you for joining us in celebrating these incredible games and designers who have shaped the hobby we love. For more details and to explore even more amazing games, visit BoardGameGeek.com.